All right, welcome back to another episode of the Big Douglas Show. It is a Wednesday, so we are diving deep into the numbers and trying to learn something new. And for that, today we brought in Kent Platte, the math bomb. Kent, thanks for doing this today.
No problem, man. Appreciate you having me on.
For those that don't know, Kent developed what we now all refer to as RAS, the Relative Athletic Score. Let's start from a journalism standpoint with the who's, the what's, the where's, the when's, and the why's. How did we come up with this and when?
So back in around 2013, I developed this. It was meant to be a way to contextualize player testing metrics a lot better than what we had. We had Le'Veon Bell come out that year, and one of the big arguments against Bell was that he wasn't athletic. And I really didn't like the way those terms were getting thrown around because he ran not even a poor 40, an average 40. And that was the only real reasoning. The
In the
rest
four
of his
sixes,
tests, yeah, and the rest of his tests were fine. And for a back his size, a 4.6 is not even that big of a concern. But that was the whole argument, was that he lacked athleticism because of the one drill. And you see this every year with these buzzwords. You have a guy that's quick but not fast, or this guy's explosive. And I wanted to find a way to better contextualize that, so I created a system that puts all of those testing metrics on a 0 to 10 scale based on the position group. Anybody can understand 0 to 10, and if you can't, it's stoplight color coded, and everybody can understand that. It puts everything in a nice, easy to digest format, and since it's all math, there's no opinion in any of this. It's all just what the numbers tell us.
are you a tape grinder or specifically a numbers man?
I watch a lot of tape. I wouldn't say I'm a grinder. I don't have enough time in the day to watch that much tape. But you can't walk into the draft season without having a good idea of who's going to test and why, and being able to identify those traits on tape to begin with. I generally tend to focus on those athletic traits more than I do the big picture football stuff. But as a fan of football, it's impossible to watch tape and not have that be part of it, right?
Do you know, are teams use this system more than others? Do you get feedback from around the league on? Well, I'll put it like this: so, like Washington feels like since Ron Rivera's gotten there, have drafted a lot of really high RAS score guys. Do you get that kind of feedback from around the league?
Most of who I deal with are scouts and agents, and actually players themselves quite a bit. The actual NFL teams themselves, there's a lot of old dogs in NFL teams. They've all got their own internal metrics that they have developed. There are some that are similar enough that I would bet that they're indistinguishable. The Green Bay Packers is a good example. Whatever metric they're using, if it isn't specifically this, and I don't know for sure that it would be, but whatever it is, it's similar enough that this is a good proxy for it. And I think that's what you're getting with a lot of other teams, is that the method of evaluating athletic talent is probably pretty similar.
How do you go about? Okay, let's do it this way. What is the most important, do you think, when it comes to what is weighted the highest on these RAS scores? Like what is very important? Like a guy like Hamilton this year, right? Didn't run a very fast 40, but his explosion numbers were high enough that his grade still was good. Am I in the ballpark there? So what numbers tend to be the most important?
So everything's weighted the same. Nothing is weighted separately. And I actually hadn't looked into which one matters the most for a high score until fairly recently. It was brought up by Eric Galco from Optimum Scouting, and I went and looked into it. Size is pretty much the weakest link in terms of players who have a high score. Guys that have a high score tend to be high in everything. That's why they have a high score to begin with. But speed is generally the biggest factor running the 40-yard dash. Now, when I say speed, I'm not just talking about the 40-yard dash, though. We're also talking about your 20 split and your 10 split, and that's where you get a guy like Hamilton, who, even though he didn't run a great 40, he ran a very, very average 40 at 4.59. His 10-yard split was really good. So his speed score wasn't as bad as it would be for a metric that only uses the 40-yard dash, because his initial get-off was still really good.
What are there positions that require a good RAS score to be successful, or have you found positions that if you tank on this RAS score, there's just little to no way you're going to have success at the next level?
Yeah, when I developed it, that wasn't the intention. The intention was to try to make this stuff more accessible to fans. But whenever you put a number on something, you get a good way to evaluate things over time. And because RAS is equally distributed each year, it's a pretty good metric to use for something like tracking success in the NFL. Tight ends generally tend to be the most reliant on athleticism overall. The best tight ends tend to have the best scores. There are a few that don't have elite tier scores, Zach Ertz, Mark Andrews, but those guys still have good scores. They just don't have those top tier above 8 scores. On the other end of the spectrum, there aren't any good examples of tight ends who have tested poorly and found success in the NFL. The closest that we get in the last 20 something years is Jordan Reed. And the only reason he had a lower score is because he was smaller for a tight end and he only ran the 40 and did bench. So his score was lower because he didn't do the explosion drills or the agility drills, which I have no doubt he would have done well in. Jordan Reed was injured at the time, which, if you know his career, makes total sense.
We know it all too well.
But as far as health or as far as overall athleticism, there just aren't any examples of low-scoring tight ends who do well. You see something similar with pass rushers, specifically speed rushers. Speed rushers tend to be really, really athletic. There aren't a whole lot of poor athletic guys that do well, and the few that have been undrafted free agents who just found a different way to get into the NFL or one after going from one team to another team. There's 3-4 edges don't tend to test all that well compared to other ends. This is where we get into the traditional positions versus edge and DL and those types of conversations. But pass rushers, tight ends, offensive tackles, because they have to face off against those pass rushers, tend to be the guys that rely on athleticism more.
Is the size is cyclical in the NFL? It's interesting. Do you redo the charts to fit the narrative accordingly? So, like, it used to be you wanted a real tall receiver, right? And so then you'd get really tall corners. Then to pivot from that, now we're seeing shiftier wide receivers again. How do you adjust to that to keep the metric right?
I don't, because there's not really a need to for size. The size metrics aren't an ideal grade. We're not grading an ideal for the size. We're just grading whether they're big or not. The size grades are meant to weight the other scores for the final grade. So when you have a guy with a lower score, that's just weighting the rest of the scores, because guys that are smaller tend to be faster, more agile. They tend to make up for it in other ways. When I did that study I mentioned earlier that looked at the guys that had scored high, height and weight were the lowest correlation to a high score. So it doesn't prevent a player from having a high score if they're not the biggest. Guys that are bigger don't tend to run as fast, don't tend to be explosive. And when they are, they get a high score because they are legitimately great athletes, especially for their size. And circling back to Kyle Hamilton, that's one of the things that really helps him is, even though he ran a 4.59 and that's an average time for a safety, he's the biggest safety that's come out in the draft in decades and one of the biggest safeties ever. So the fact that he ran an average 40 time doesn't really mean all that much in the grand scheme, because if you adjust it for size, that's perfectly fine.
Do we need, you brought that up, and I think it's an interesting point. Do we need to be reshifting the way we look at the positions and the way we grade them? Because you're right, and like Ron Rivera for Washington says it all the time, this position flex, right? Where you take a guy that plays safety, you'd like to be able to play him at linebacker, you'd like to get him in at the nickel corner or Buffalo nickel in Washington. So is it making it harder to grade these guys? I know on your end, it's strictly a math thing. You plug the numbers in, but do we need to be re-looking at the way we assign value to the positions?
So I mentioned that this is all about contextualizing the data, and I think that's where we get to that point where there's more context than just the raw score. Kyle Hamilton, for example, tested out very good as a safety, despite that 40 time, tested out very good as a safety. He tests even better as a linebacker. So if you as a coach, as a general manager, are planning on bringing a player in who's going to play that hybrid safety linebacker role, that's the type of profile you're looking for, a guy that can do those types of things, because the safeties that tend to be really, really fast aren't usually that big. So you open yourself up to that type of versatility. Stuff for like RAS, you can change positions on RAS right beneath the card. There's a drop down to switch positions, and you can see what they would score at other positions. One of the things that we're currently working on for next draft cycle, is an entirely new subset of positions, which will hopefully encompass some of the more modern positional situations we have in the NFL, where we have edge rusher instead of DE and linebacker, and we have IDL instead of defensive tackle, and then 3-4 defensive ends, which score completely differently. They would be weighted against each other instead. We're hoping to incorporate that in the next draft cycle.
I know if Nate was here today and he had some stuff come up, but he wanted me to ask him, can you explain the speed score and why it matters? Was, I know, one of the questions he wanted to ask today.
So you always look at speed as something really important. It tends to get overweighted by a lot of folks because they look at just that one data point and nothing else. But I'm sure you've heard people say, well, when are you running 40 yards in a straight line in the NFL? But that's not the only thing that you're testing with the 40-yard dash. You're testing a player's ability to get up to speed, to accelerate quickly, and then maintain that speed over a distance. That's transferable at every single position, even offensive line, even defensive line, where they're not necessarily doing that every play. But if they have the ability to do that, you can do a lot more with them. Using offensive tackle as an example, you're not usually asking an offensive tackle to run 40 yards in a straight line. But if you have an offensive tackle that you can motion across your formation once this ball is snapped and run from, say, left tackle all the way across the formation to right tackle on a run play to take out a speed rusher on the other side, if he has that kind of athleticism, that opens up a whole new type of play calling that you can do that you wouldn't even have access to if you had a guy that was a little bit slower and more sluggish, more of a power guy even. So it depends on what you're doing from a schematical standpoint for whether or not the 40-yard dash matters and whether or not the scores for that stuff matters. But the scores that we use at RAS are just based against the position group. So if you have a guy that runs a 4.5 at wide receiver, that's about average. I think it might be a little bit above average. But if you run that as a defensive end, that's one of the best times ever at defensive end. That's a huge deal if you have a guy with that kind of speed. Because, again, you're not just measuring how's he going to run 40 yards. You're measuring how quickly he can accelerate and get up to speed and maintain it. So it becomes a bigger deal, which is why you see higher scores at some positions than others.
Do you find teams that use the RAS score, try to figure out the best way to ask it, like win now mode, right? So the RAS scores seem to be, for coaches, the lump of clay that they like to mold. But do you see a correlation between that and maybe the guys that just have higher floors that may help you in win now mode?
See, I've heard it described both ways. I've heard people look at the testing and see, that's a player's ceiling, how good they can be. And I've seen it described as, that's their floor. That's like the minimum because it allows more room for error if you make mistakes. And I think the true answer is somewhere in between that, right? I don't like to hedge my bets, but I don't think there's a clear answer one way or the other because it's going to vary depending on the player and the types of talents that they have. You look at a player like Danielle Hunter, whose tape was extremely underwhelming in college. He had one move, which was throw your shoulder into a guy and kind of push. But he had ridiculous athletic traits, and he was able to land with a coach who knew how to develop that type of player into someone who could do a lot more of the technical stuff. And because of that, he had that athletic talent that once he started to win, he was winning quickly. He was winning better, and he was winning consistently. So for him, that's a ceiling thing more than it is a floor. You get a running back, I think in general, when you're looking at a running back, that gives you a bit more leeway early because if you can get him a lane and he's got that speed and that explosion, you're going to get more yardage because he's going to be able to get upfield quicker. You can learn the blocking assignments and how to understand lanes and that balance and all that stuff. You can learn those things over time. But maybe having that extra athleticism up front gives you a little bit of an edge up early because you got more room for making mistakes.
People who watch this show know that there's two teams I love, the Commanders and the Bulldogs. Will this go down? Will this be the greatest RAS grouping of one draft class to come out of a college?
It is by far. I can't remember if it was Dane, it might have been Matt Miller. One of those guys had asked about whether this was, they had 9 guys over 9.0 RAS. And he said that that's got to be the highest ever. And we looked up, and yeah, it's the highest ever by 3 players. The next highest was only 6. So the Georgia Bulldogs from this class have the most athletic draft class I've ever recorded over 37 years of data, and it's not particularly close.
I was surprised that Zamir White was ranked higher on the list than James Cook. I can't imagine that you weren't also.
I was very surprised by that, and this is those pleasant surprises you get, right? We had this with Charlie Kohler also, where they don't really look all that athletic on tape, and then they test off the charts, and you're like, whoa, now I got to go back and watch the tape. What did I miss? What was there that I wasn't seeing? And sometimes it's purely technique. They're just not technically advanced enough to use their athleticism, and you can build on that. You'll have some coaches that really love that kind of stuff because they eat it right up. But Zamir White was a great example. He doesn't look like he's super explosive on tape. He looks like a regular road grading type of guy who gets whatever chunk yardage he can get, and then he comes out and tests really well. And there's going to be coaches that look at that and say, you know what? I've got a good enough line. I can do something with that. I can give him some space and see if he can make something work with it.
A guy like Jordan Davis, I mean, it'll be interesting about the Bulldog players, right? Because they were not asked to go be stat stuffers. In fact, they were asked to do quite the opposite. Be team forward, do your job, and let's go win a national championship. You mentioned Daniil Hunter. That I'm assuming you brought him up because I think that's a lot of the Trayvon Walker comps, right? It's like he didn't do a ton, but the traits are there. And I loved how you say that because I think too many times people look at the stats part or the scores part, or they watch too much of the tape, and really it's trying to find that balance of somewhere in between, right?
Yeah, there's always that balance in between. And I'm saying this is the guy that invented this metric. If you're just looking at that metric, you are doing it wrong.
Right.
You're not doing it right. There's plenty of things to look at with players that contribute to player success. This is just a piece of the puzzle. It's helpful to look at trends and try to find examples. Daniil Hunter's a great example for a guy like Trayvon Walker. I think from the concept, I don't think from a player style he really matches. I used Rashawn Gary, which I think was much closer to even where Trayvon Walker is considered before he had his excellent combine, was kind of where Gary was before he had his excellent combine. And I think that's more what you're looking at is there might be a longer transition period into the NFL because we're trying to get him to do things he hasn't done before. But we now know from his testing that he has the talent to do it. And there's enough there on tape that we can say, I've seen you do this on occasion. We just need to see it all the time.
Will he be the second pick for your Detroit Lions?
I don't think so. I think the Lions are pretty well stuck on Hutchinson and Thibodeau as their first 2 guys. Walker's probably 3rd or 4th there. So it's going to be between those 2 guys, Walker and Hamilton probably.
Do you try to extrapolate for a guy like Chase Young, who just didn't do hardly any drills? Do you just say, thanks for nothing and keep it moving? Or do you try to figure out ways to get the numbers that you can get some kind of score for him? Because the score's not out, right? I'm curious where he would have tested.
I think he would have tested well, but it's one of those things where it sucks that he didn't test, but did he really have to? Chase Young came out in a draft where he was the consensus number 1 overall guy from the start, and he didn't really have anything meaningful that came up in the draft cycle to try to knock him off that perch. We see this a lot with quarterbacks. Malik Willis, for example, didn't need to test. I wish he would have. I wish Lamar Jackson would have tested. I wish Kyler Murray would have tested. I think it would be great because I'm greedy to have all of these guys test, but they don't need to. And if you don't need to and you don't, I totally understand it. I wish you would. I get annoyed by it, but it's just me being selfish. I was annoyed Kenny Pickett didn't run the cone drill. He tested really well in everything, and he didn't test in the one place he would have done even better in, and that frustrates me.
Do you think Chase would have tested better than his line mate Montez Sweat, who I think was a 9-8 type of Raz guy, if I recall correctly?
I think he would have been up there. I think his floor would have probably been around where Thibodeau is, which is like 9.6 or something like that. I think that's probably where his floor was. My opinion of Chase Young was very high. A lot of that had to do with his athletic talents. It was all there. I don't think he was quite Myles Garrett where Myles Garrett was, but he was pretty close to that level. And Myles Garrett was a 9.99. So
Ridiculous. Do you tend to get more value out of a different position, Raz-wise? I'm thinking about Commanders at 11, and now we're starting to have the conversation about, if a guy like Derek Stingley Jr. should take a slide or a Kyle Hamilton to 11, and you're starting to weigh, athletic traits and also value, positional value as far as dollars-wise. Better to go like corner in that round one with 11 and then come back for wide receiver at 47, or you like wide receiver at 11 and worry about next available at 47?
So this is where you get into that conversation about typing. And this is one of those harder to explain types of situations with a metric like RAS, which is meant to be relative to the position group, right? Well, not every position group has the same types of players. Christian Watson is a very different type of wide receiver than Sky Moore, and they tested very differently. Both of those guys are very different types of receivers than Calvin Austin, who tested pretty well, especially well for his size. But these aren't the same players. You're not going to use them the same way on game day. And comparing them to one another, it's fair because they're receivers. But at the same time, they're not going to have the same role in the NFL. So when you start looking at the types of players that you're looking for, you have to pay attention to type. And you end up with some types that don't necessarily have elite scores most of the time. Using Sky Moore as an example, Sky Moore comped very closely to Golden Tate. Golden Tate didn't have an elite score either, but he did have great speed, great explosion. That's what Sky Moore has. And he was able to use the types of stuff he shows on tape very well with that type of profile. Another example that I've liked to use is Allgeier from BYU, who is a running back, and he doesn't have an elite profile. He's got a good enough profile. It's like 7 something, I think. But his profile is almost exactly like David Montgomery and CJ Anderson, guys that we've seen with success in the NFL, and we know that type of role, and that's the type of player that he is when it comes to being a rusher. So it's important to take into account the type of player they are, and if they compare to other players who have been successful, who also played similarly, that's the key part, then it doesn't really matter if they didn't score elite, because they still scored that type of player. They scored on that level.
Were there a couple of, before we wrap up here, I'm curious, were there a couple of guys that tested better than you had expected, and maybe a couple of guys that you assumed were going to test really well and just didn't?
Yeah, we get a couple every year, and it's always surprising. You always have to go back and watch them and figure out whether it was something you missed, or if maybe there was some other mitigating factor, or maybe they just win in a different way that you weren't accounting for. I already mentioned Charlie Kohler, Zamir White. Those were the two really big ones, I think, for me that tested way better than expectations. As far as lower than expectations, I didn't expect Isaiah Likely, the tight end from Coastal Carolina. I didn't expect him to test below average. He ran a 4.8 flat, I think, might have been a 4.84. So his 40-yard dash wasn't really good. His speed scores weren't really good. A little bit less than we expected. Trey McBride, actually another example. Trey McBride tested way better, I think, than a lot of people expected. That was the big concern with him, is if he was going to be fast enough to play tight end in the NFL. He ran a 4.59, had good enough explosion drills. He's had an elite score, even though he wasn't expected to test all that well. Veron McKinley, the safety out of Oregon, didn't test very well. Sometimes you don't expect them to test well, but you don't expect them to test as poorly as they did. And that's a little frustrating too. And I think that was kind of the situation with him, is that it was a little bit worse than I had expected. But if you like their tape, then it isn't a question about whether or not you think they're going to do well in the NFL. It becomes a question of value and valuation. Where would you pick that type of player, knowing that a testing like that puts them at greater risk to bust out, less likely to succeed? So where do you pick them? Where do you put that guy in the draft? Usually it's a little bit lower than you might have thought before.
I know for years the Packers basically drafted tackles and moved them inside. Does the RAS system, do you get a bump from moving tackle into guard? And are you surprised more teams don't do that because of the athletic profile that most tackles have?
It's happening more because teams are trending towards bigger guards and bigger centers. And that's usually where some of that bump comes from tackles moving inside, is that they just tend to be bigger people. Tackles are huge. Every year I have to explain to people, we'll have a tackle come out with us who's like 6'5", and that's a below average height score. And people will be like, how is that below average? And it's like, because it's below average.
Right.
Offensive tackles are gigantic. You don't understand. They're huge people. So part of it's the size. Tackles tend to be the most athletic players on a football field anyway, from an offensive standpoint. They're the best tackles are ridiculous athletes. And being able to move like that is just an insane talent. You move a guy like that inside, they tend to get a bump because guards don't tend to be that way. And a lot of schemes, especially in college, maybe a little less so in the pros now, but a lot of guards in college football don't have to do a whole lot of moving from where they are. They don't do a lot of pulling. They're generally just stay in the spot, block the guy in front of you, or push him in that direction. Obviously oversimplifying this a bit, but they don't have to be very athletic. So they don't tend to get drafted that high because they don't tend to be very good projectable players because they aren't asked to do a whole lot. It's the same thing with centers. Centers tend to not be as athletic as the guys outside of them. There's other stuff at center that I haven't figured out yet. It has the lowest correlation for athletic testing to success of any position is center.
Really?
And I haven't figured out why. I've talked to NFL offensive linemen who've given me their opinions, and I tend to defer to theirs because they know more than me. But I haven't figured it out from a math standpoint, so I probably won't fully get it until I find that.
One last one. Although I don't think there's the premier receiver in this class that there was last year. It's a deep class, and I wonder if this is something we won't continue to see with like the evolution of 7-on-7 in high school, where we're just going to see more and more receivers every year. Have you seen that trend? Am I the only one here seeing that?
I don't think you're the only one seeing it. I think that it's people starting to catch on to what's been going on forever. Receiver is a really sexy position for high school players coming out. It gets a lot of accolades. You get to celebrate more than anybody else. You get to push some people around. You get to run fast, catch footballs. There's a lot of advantages to being a receiver. An example that I got this draft cycle is I just now hit 1,000 tight ends with an actual RAS score in the database. I forget how many we have total, but not all of them have qualified for a score. Wide receivers, I'm up to like 3,000 something.
Oh,
just some ridiculous number. Let me pull it up and see now because I'm curious what it was. It's a huge number because we just get more receivers. 2,768. So not quite 3,000 yet, but getting there. It's just 2.5 times what we have for tight ends because there's 2 receivers who start on each side, and then nickel or slot receiver is a totally different position, and we have different guys come out every year that match that type of archetype. We've got a lot of receivers that come out every year, and I think the NFL has started to devalue that top dog receiver in favor of multiple receiver sets where they can have a couple of different guys who can do different things. And that trend picked up very quickly. And if they stay with it, I think you're going to see that every year. It's going to be, this is a deep wide receiver class every year.
If a guy like Desmond Ridder is there, will the Lions trade back up into the first round for him?
I don't think the Lions are going to trade up in the first round, and for either of their picks, obviously at 2, they're not going to trade up to 1. But I don't really see them trading up from 32 either, especially for a quarterback. They might take one if somebody like Ridder falls to 32 and they like him. Howell's another guy that I've seen that I think they might consider at that position. I think they're more likely to trade out of 32 and down. I don't see them trading out of 2. I think they want to. But I don't see them trading out of that second overall spot. But I think they've got a lot better options at 32 to move down and maybe acquire some more picks. And then they get into whether they're going to draft a quarterback day 2, which for anybody that's followed me knows you don't do that. Don't do that.
It's quarterback in round 2. And also, I hate running back early, right? I mean, are we at the point where drafting running back in round 1 or 2 don't do that?
It depends on what your team needs. So every position, including running back, the players who are drafted higher tend to do better in the NFL. They tend to have more opportunities in the NFL. They tend to be more successful. And that includes running backs. Running backs that are drafted in the first round get more opportunities, and they tend to do well. I think if a team has a good enough roster and they feel like that running back is good enough to propel their offense to a higher level, totally go for it. I don't think that there are that many teams in the NFL that match that description, though. It's similar to tight end, where in general, drafting a tight end is just not going to move the needle all that much in the first round. So you just got to find out where your team is at. We are unfortunately more experienced than any team in the NFL, speaking of the Lions, in drafting a tight end because you like them more than anybody else, even though you don't really need that to fix your franchise. And then, surprise, it doesn't work, and now you've got to move back and restart and reevaluate. But the running back is the same situation. If it doesn't move the needle that much because your team is rebuilding, that could be a problem. The Jaguars drafted Travis Etienne last year, and I predicted that was one of the only things I got right about the draft last year was that they were going to take Lawrence and Etienne. And I don't think that was a good choice from a franchise perspective, because even though it made sense, like you could make that work in your head. You got a new quarterback. You want to give him a guy that can rush and receive, give him that outlet and potentially a rushing threat. But the team was just so weak at that point. There were so many better ways they could fix their roster than running back.
Kent, generally, I don't have facial hair envy on these podcasts, but you have saddened me and made me reconsider the handlebar mustache.
I had to put on a mask today, so it's a little messy. I'm trying to get it back under control, but yeah, that's why I put it on the logo, man. I got to have it out there. People got to know this thing exists.
That's right. This is a thing of beauty. He is at MathBomb on Twitter. You can catch all his content there. It is raz.nfl, the website.
Football.
Football. Say it again.
Raz.football.
Raz.football. Very good. And it's great. So go out there and check it out. And thank you, sir, for giving us some time today.
Appreciate it for having me.
All right, man. Thanks.
Thanks so much.